I mean, we've looked at uh, health systems in the African context. I want us to also talk a little bit about leadership and representation in global health. I know that it's not only in Africa, but in the context of Africa, what barriers do women, particularly, women in the global health space, face in achieving leadership positions in global health, and how do you think this can be improved or overcome?
Okay. So a few weeks ago, if you'd asked me this, I would have said, oh, well, the studies show that we need more education, we need more mentorship, we need more networking, we need more this, we need more that, women need to do that. There was the American movement to sort of, leaning in and all that. But actually, I think that the barrier, the fundamental barrier is the system. The system is designed to keep women out. That is pure and simple. So it doesn't matter how much we increase the educational opportunities for women. It's important, but it's not sufficient. It doesn't matter how much effort we put into leadership courses, and we need to make sure, of course, that the right leadership courses, not that my first experience of one. I must say that subsequently I had much more positive leadership development experiences than that very first one. It's not just about making ensuring that women have access to mentors and sponsors and such like. Those are important but not sufficient. We need to actually look at the system within which those women then have to operate, and if that system is as it is, and I think this applies whether it's in Africa, in Europe, North America, in Asia, the system is designed by and for men. And so, for women to really be able to get into the system, be leaders in system, stay and be successful in the system, that system has got to be changed. We've got to make it one that is designed for men and women equally. That means that the
The
system
system
needs
needs
to
to
needs to
needs to
consider
consider
not
not
just
just
as
as
a
a
nice to
nice to
have
have
extra that
extra
you
that you
tag on
tag
at
on at
the
the
end.
end.
From the
From the
beginning,
beginning,
who what
what
are the
are the
needs
needs
of
of
every
every
person
person
who
who
should be
should be
part of
part
the
of the
leadership
leadership
narrative in
narrative
this
in this
space,
space,
and
and
build it
build
in.
it in.
And
And
it's
it's
not
not
a,
a,
I was at a women's conference once, I won't mention which one, a few years ago, where in the room they're talking about, how do we enable women to participate in leadership and be represented in the workplace. And a very well-meaning young man stood up and said, um, I help my wife to look after the kids so she can do her when she has to go to work, or when she was doing her exams. I help my wife to look after the kids. I get them ready for bed so she can study. And he got a round of applause. And then me being me, I stood up and asked him, I said, they're your children too, aren't they? You're not helping your wife, you're doing your job. And if you're just helping her the odd day a week, you're not helping. You shouldn't. You should be. The responsibility should be shared and owned equitably. So that's what I mean about the system, where you just give a little bit and say, okay, we're making it. We're helping you women to get into leadership positions. That
that
doesn't
doesn't
work.
work,
And if
And
you
if you
don't
don't
change the
change the
system, those
system, those
women
women
get
get
in.
in.
And
And
I
I
can
can
tell
tell
you
you
from my
from my
own
own
personal
personal
experiences how hard it is to be the token. Now, when I say token, it's not that you're not qualified, because invariably you might actually be the most qualified in that space, because like our parents told us, if you're black and you're working in the West, you need to be 4 times as good to get half as far. That also, then you add being a woman as well. So there's the intersectionality for being a black woman, where you have to be better than everybody to get in, and then but then you get into a system that wasn't designed for you to stay there. So there's the talk post COVID of the Great Resignation. We need to look at, break down those statistics a bit and look about how many women of color are actually leaving because those systems were not designed for them to stay and feel comfortable and thrive in those spaces. So I don't need to repeat all the things about, being access to training, yada yada yada, mentorship and all that. My focus is the system. if the recruitment system, if the workplace
place
environment, the
environment, the
policies,
policies,
they
they
don't
don't
allow
allow
for there
for
to
there to
be
be
as
as
many
many
qualified
qualified
women in
women
the
in the
room as
room
there
as
are
there are
men,
men,
it's
it's
going to
going to
fail.
fail.
So
So
we've
we've
got,
got,
we've
we've
done
done
enough of
enough
the
of the
ticking,
ticking,
jumping
jump
the
in the
hoops and
hoops and
saying,
saying,
you'll get
you'll
this
get this
amount of
amount of
degrees.
degrees.
Been there,
Been there,
got
got
those.
those.
Get these
Get these
mentors,
mentors,
network,
network,
that
that
tick all
tick
those
all those
boxes.
boxes.
And
Yeah.
And
still,
still,
let's
let's
look at the
look at the
data
data
from
from
the
the
Beijing
Beijing.
Declaration. At this rate of change, my great 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 grandchildren will still be dealing with the imbalance of women in leadership in the health system. So we've got to change that system. And it's the same, it's not just an African issue. That system, it may, the veneer might be thicker in other regions of the world, but the same challenges exist, that the system wasn't designed for women to be part of it, not in a leadership position, definitely. And until we change that, we will, you'll just have women who come in, fight all the hurdles getting, and then they just burn out and crash because they're constantly beating their heads against the wall.
Yeah, yeah. I think this is such a profound revelation. You've highlighted several crucial points. You've also mentioned the importance of mentoring and capacity building, and even when that is done, there's still a barrier to
Yeah.
um, getting to to the apex of your career. Um,
Mhm.
but when you talk about a system, what specific areas of the system, what really are the essential elements that need to be remodeled or changed in order to ensure a more equitable distribution, for example, in leadership roles?
Right. So
Right.
if
So
I
if
had
I
a
had a
magic
magic,
wand, I would wave it and change the mindsets of all the men in the system. Even my experience, and there may be others who have a different experience, but this is my experience. My experience is even the most well-intentioned men
men
in
in
leadership
leadership
positions
positions
have
have
that
that
little,
little,
often
often
unconscious
unconscious,
Yeah.
or
ingrained
ingrained
perception
perception
of
of
this
this
subsidiarity of
subsidiarity of
women to
women to
men.
men.
So
So we
we in
in the
the equity movement need to focus some of our re-education on the men, and it's not just about men being allies. It's actually men ch- actually doing the work. So in the racism conversations, we talk about the fact that white people need to do the internal work to understand their own role in the status quo. It applies also in the gender inclusion argument that even the most intentioned men need to do the work to recognize where their biases might actually be a part of the problem. So that's one. And then while we're working on, another, I'd like to drop names of people I admire. John Amechi is a former NBA basketball, US basketball player who is a work psychology of the workplace expert who I hugely admire. And he's on LinkedIn and Twitter a lot. So if you don't know him, I recommend you go and look him up. But he talks about the fact that he said it doesn't really matter if people have unconscious biases if the system is right, because the system will stop those unconscious biases from influencing the outcomes. So that
that
means that
means
we
that we
have to
have to
build
build
into
into
those
those
systems
systems
policies
policies
that say
that say
very
very
categorically
categorically
recruitment
recruitment
should be
should be
blind on
blind on
gender
gender
or
or
race.
race.
The
The
workplace
workplace
should
should
allow
allow
and
and
enable
enable
for
for
people's
people's
different
different
biological
biological
needs.
needs.
Um, the whole of society benefits from the biological function of childbirth, which sits with women. So why is the workplace not designed for that to allow that to happen? And why should a woman be penalized for giving birth to people who are going to pay your pension, my pension? So dealing with the biases is one aspect, but making sure that the system doesn't allow those biases to influence outcome. So that's about, office place policies. We know that it's so much about gender-based violence in the educational systems, in the workplace. Those are key factors that take qualified women out of the workplace and they don't stay. But then also we then go back and this is where we have to, because much as we talk about the positive benefits of the culture, that the various cultures on the African continent, we also recognize that there's some very negative practices in our culture that need to be addressed. And I would argue, and if a few years ago we had a side event on the historical role of women in leadership on the African continent, where Professor Ngozi Achebe, she's a historian in the US of Nigerian descent, the child of Chinua Achebe, the author, gave us a masterclass on the pre-colonial role of women in African society, and how a lot of what we call traditional roles of women in Africa today are actually Victorian colonial imports. So if we go back to our history, those roles are not necessarily there. But then we do need to also acknowledge that there's some things that are in our cultures that need to change. Culture is dynamic. It's not set in stone. So the fact that we use, I mean, if we think about it, I think it was Chimamanda Adichie who said that, a few decades, a few hundred years ago, they used to kill twins, but we don't anymore. So if the culture's evolved to not do that, so why can the culture evolve to not ban women from the public space because they're on their periods? And again, I would use an example in the UK for where Viagra is, I believe, now available over the counter because it's a male issue, but there's restrictions and access to contraception that women need. Research. If you think about it, the amount of funds going into research on issues that concern men is disproportionate to that goes into. So look at endometriosis. Endometriosis is so widespread and we're not doing research into that. So it's about the system. You have to ask yourself in every aspect of the system, where is everybody who should be part of this question and the solution? And if we make a habit of doing that and then saying, so how do we need to design it so those people can engage? You just need to think about physical disability, for example, and access to buildings, for example. I was in an online thing where I was reminded of my own bias, where I have a very loud voice. And so when the microphone wasn't talking, I went, that's okay, I have a very loud voice, I can talk. Totally failing to recognize that the microphone enables somebody who's hearing impaired to use their hearing aid to hear me better. Somebody made a comment on that, and since that time, I make a conscious point of making sure that I ask for the microphone if it's there, in case there's someone who needs it. But we should build that into the system where it says every conference, webinar thing where you have speakers should consider and assume by default that there are accessibility issues for others, because we have the solutions to address that. So it's about actually making it so that people's conscious or unconscious biases become inconsequential. They've done blind recruitment, for example, where you don't put those factors that indicate whether an applicant is white or black or male or female, and shown that it doesn't therefore matter if the person doing the shortlisting is biased, if you create a system where they can't see those factors that will allow them to be biased. Although it's, you should note that it's not just whether you tick the gender box or your race box, even that can give clues as to whether you are white, black, male or female. So there needs to be thorough work done to make sure that when you're actually doing gender and race-blind recruitment, that you really consider not just the tick box of gender and race, but also other pointers that might lead a biased selector to default to their biases and preferences. I could go on, but those are a few examples of
yeah. I can see how you're passionate. You're passionate about this particular topic, and it's rightly so. I think that, as you've said, institutions have to change. The mentality has to change for us to see a significant improvement in this.